during this well, subplenary of sorts, I'm gonna share some ideas I have on scaffolding, as it's considered to be something of a holy grail to CLIL. It's mentioned in all of the books, but I'm a bit worried that not everyone is on the same page as to what it actually is. Practically the same as applies to CLIL, because if you talk about what CLIL is, you could have an entire hour about that as well, but that's not the topic of today. So I have to say, doing a subplenary, so talking for a long time without having a lot of interactive elements in there, it's not something I often do. So I might just deviate from the subject every now and then because I just like talking. I planned for about 45 minutes, but that will be fine. So as I said, more of a workshop guy. So I'm going to mention some things that we're going to learn this session. And I've been a teacher for almost 50 years, so I like to work with learning objectives. What we're going to talk about is why scaffolding is important and how it can be used in your lesson and what activities you can do to promote scaffolding techniques in your lesson. Now, this is something that I will talk about again at the end of the session and see if we indeed discussed all of these. And as I mentioned before, and was mentioned before, you can ask any questions you might have. Let's talk about the first one first a bit. Why scaffolding is very often mentioned in a CLIL context, but do we actually know if it works? And why does it work? And what is scaffolding actually? That's what I'm going to talk about during the first part of the plenary. Now, how can we use that in our lesson? I took the liberty of looking at some research concerning scaffolding, and I will share with you some ideas based on that research on how you can apply it. So some structure, some ideas, and also a lot of practical activities that you can use in your lesson to support your students, both with their learning and their language. So that is what I will talk about during this session. Now, I also prepared a slide where I was going to introduce myself, but I can skip that really quickly now because everything was already mentioned. It sounds very fancy if you say that I had a lot of experience as a CLIL teacher, and it sounds like that's been a long time ago, but it's not. I was a CLIL teacher until this summer, a mathematics teacher, and I only since this summer have become a full-time CLIL coach and teacher trainer. You might know me from CLIL magazine, which was published a couple of years ago, but I stopped publishing that after 10 issues. But it was read all over the world, which was quite a lot of work. And because I was still teaching 4 days a week, I decided to stop with that because there were so many things I wanted to do and I just wanted to do other things. But you can find me now. My company is called CLIL Media, and I'm just like what just mentioned. I try to help out CLIL teachers all over the world with their CLIL teaching, especially with stopping to reinvent the wheel, because I'm under the impression a lot of teachers try to solve things on their own that they don't have to solve on their own, because there's so many teachers worldwide with the same challenges, really. By the way, if you have any questions, you can post them in the chat. I'm not going to look at it constantly, but I might just look at it somewhere halfway or at the end. But please feel free to ask questions in the chat if you have any. So let's talk about what scaffolding is first. I'm going to minimize this screen so I don't constantly have to look at my own head. Now, for example, construction has to do with scaffolding, language, reception, learning, transformation. All of these things have to do with scaffolding. And during this session, I'm going to show you how all of these different phrases actually relate to scaffolding and how they can help you in your lessons. Let's talk about the definitions first. Now, I looked up a couple of them. First one is from 1986. This is the original idea. It's a process of setting up the situation to make the child's entry easy and successful, and then gradually pulling back and handling the role to the student as he or she becomes skilled enough to manage it. For the record, it says child here. This was researched with kids in the age of 7 to 18 months. So that's why children are mentioned in here. And this was one of the first moments scaffolding was mentioned in this sense. But there is more recent research as well. For example, Hammond, I will put all the references at the end. He mentions temporary supporting structures that will assist learners to develop new understandings and new concepts and new abilities. And the thing that I like in this definition is the word temporary here. This is crucial. Scaffolding is not meant to be something that's there all the time. It's something that's helped to, well, get students going, and at some point let them go and do it on their own, or at least diminish the amount of scaffolding that is used. One more, scaffolding leads learners to reach beyond what they are able to achieve alone, to participate in new situations, and to tackle new tasks. And here, the important part that I want, the reason I took out this definition is because it's mentioned beyond what they are able to achieve alone. And I will mention this a bit more later on when we talk about the zone of proximal development. But the idea is that they want to do a task, and you just help them a bit so they can go a little further, but then continue on their own. That's scaffolding. It's different from, for example, helping out, where you just basically give them an example that they have to follow immediately, or you give the answer or whatever. No, you really help them to take that small next step and continue working on their own. That is what scaffolding is all about. Now, if you want to see a few more examples where scaffolding might not have gone correct, obviously I can't not share this picture. We all know what this is. And I see that the picture is also slightly tilted. So it's not as, tilted as it really is in reality. It's even more now, I mean, on the picture. But the point is that sometimes when you use scaffolding, things might still go wrong, or they might take a bit longer than needed. This scaffolding has been around since 1882. So, sometimes you need a bit more scaffolding before the construction, the learning process is completed, but it doesn't mean that you should never use it. Now, in your lesson, I want to give you a practical example of what is scaffolding in your lesson and what it isn't. If you do not use scaffolding, you can say something like this: read this text and answer the questions. Clear task, students know what to do, but there's no scaffolding whatsoever. It's just they have to do it all on their own, and they don't get any strategies, they don't get any support, they just have to do it on their own. And this way, well, they might succeed, but they might also not succeed. And if they do not succeed, you're not entirely sure why not. Is it because they don't understand the language? Is it because they don't understand the key words or difficult words, a few of them in the text? Is it because they don't know the steps to take? Is it because they don't understand the question themselves? Do they know how to formulate an answer? There's a lot of things that can go wrong here. And if they don't start, you don't know, or if they can't solve this, you don't know why. So scaffolding can help with taking away some of those problems and making sure that they actually can get to work. So, for example, with scaffolding, you might say, identify the words you don't know, and we will discuss those in a minute, before you start reading the text and answer the question. Or another thing you can say is first read the text and write down the 3 most important aspects, so that afterwards you can discuss, okay, do we now understand what the text is about? And then you start answering the questions that you are supposed to answer. Or last option, write down what you already know about this topic and come up with 3 questions you don't know the answer to yet. So it's a bit of a brainstorm activity to activate prior knowledge and to make sure that we already get them ready to start learning. And with a task like this, you also know that they will, if during the discussion, you can already link this to the different words that might have to do with the text that you want them to read. I'm trying really hard not to speak too fast, because if I get enthusiastic, I tend to speak really fast. So I'm trying to slow down every now and then. All right. So some of you might have heard of him, Lev Vygotsky. He was a Russian psychologist, and he was a pioneer when it comes to development psychology. My wife is actually a psychologist, and she knew him as well, and she's not related to education in any way. So there is he did a lot of research on development psychology, and one of his ideas, not his only one, but one of his ideas was the zone of proximal development. And I'm going to show you a picture of that in a minute, but let's talk about what it is first. He said that it's the distance between the actual development level, determined by independent problem solving, and the level of potential development, as determined, should be a D there, through problem solving under adult guidance or in collaboration with more capable peers. Now notice how especially the last part of this definition is quite similar to the definition of scaffolding we saw earlier when it said, well, they have to do it on their own eventually, but they might need some guidance first. And here it's mentioned by Lev Vygotsky that the problem solving under adult guidance or in collaboration with more capable peers. So also other people helping out, supporting, making sure that they can get to the next step. It's, by the way, not an error that the date of this research is later than his death. This is taken from a book that was written later and basically summarized all of his research. So that's why the dates are different. When I wrote this down, I first was a bit confused about that. So just wanted to share that. So what is the zone of proximal development? Well, here you have a picture of it, and it means that there is a center and task that students can just easily do. And it might get a little boring if they only get things like that. If you compare this to the thinking skills of Bloom, these might just be lower order thinking skills. And there is an outer area with a lot of things students can't do. And there is an overlap between those two, and that's the zone of proximal development. Learners can do this with a little guidance. The advancements through and attainment of the upper limit of the ZPD is limited by the instructional and scaffolding related capabilities of the more knowledgeable others. In other words, this learner needs to have some kind of instruction, some kind of scaffolding related activities in order to reach a little bit further. And it's really motivating for students to actually be approached this way. So if you immediately give them a task that they can't do without any help, then they will get demotivated. But if it's something that reaches just beyond something that they can't do, beyond something they can do, then they get motivated. And this is something I know from experience. They get really motivated if they find out that they can do things that they couldn't do an hour before with a little help. And this help can be an instruction, but it more often is an activity with a little scaffolding. Now notice that here the word scaffolding is again used, and this also means that scaffolding is not something new or old, and it's also not something related to CLIL only. It's been around for quite a while. It can be used in any educational setting where learners, well, go a little bit further, and obviously that's something that we always do. Just want to say one more thing about how Lev Vygotsky approached this. He said, and I'm cheating now, I'm looking at my notes, problem solving can be placed in three categories: those performed by students independently, hence the center; those that cannot be performed even with help, so really a no can do. It's like me trying to build a house, that's not going to work; and those that fall between the two tasks that can be performed with help, and that is the zone of proximal development. Now let's talk about CLIL, because that's why you're here. Scaffolding in a CLIL setting. Everything I said so far is not related to CLIL per se. It's something that's just related to general education. But now in a CLIL classroom, scaffolding is really important as well. And why is that the case? Well, the reason is that in a CLIL classroom, key language needs to be made salient. And that means that students have to be aware of the fact that they're learning a new language while also learning a new subject. And that means that you need to help them with this new language. You can't just throw them out in the dark and say, have fun. It's not immersion education. Immersion education, you know, at international schools, for example, with 6, 7, 8 different nationalities, with all different backgrounds and all different language backgrounds, a teacher simply cannot adapt his materials to all of those different languages. So he or she will just teach, for example, in English, and the students have to catch up. That's not CLIL education. CLIL education is a type of education where where the teacher helps the students with both the language and the content. There's two types, hard and soft CLIL. Hard is where the subject teacher teaches through the second language. Soft CLIL, where the language teacher uses subject content. I will be focusing more on hard CLIL here, because that's my experience. I taught mathematics for 14 years in English, so that's what I can relate to. So to assist with scaffolding, language needs to be supported, and you can use scaffolding and embedding for that. But the point is that students need some scaffolding, some structure, some support to make sure they also learn the language. So the learning component here is something that just works in every lesson, but the language component is something that's new for CLIL. Now here you can see a picture that I took myself from scaffolding during the holidays. Scaffolding means it's an explicit form of language support. So you really show the kids, well, this is what the words that you're going to use, or this is, the structure is clear. It's basically really pointing out that there is some kind of support. The students are aware of it. They are aware of the new words you introduce. They are aware of the structures you want to impose. They are aware of the tasks that you give them and how they are structured. And more examples on that later on. But they are aware of it. It's quite obvious. Embedding, however, is more subtle. It's more implicit. With embedding, the language is weaved into the tasks or activities, and you can assume that students will pick up that language while they read it. So, for example, if you scaffold, you will say, well, these are the important words. And with embedding, the words are still there, but they are not bold anymore. They're not mentioned as keywords anymore. You assume students pick them up. You can, one might say embedding is more challenging as there's less support. But it still implies that the language used is chosen carefully. I once read that if there's more than 15 words on a page, a student will not understand what it means, what the idea is on that page, because it's too many new words. So even if you embed and you think of it before you develop the materials and you put in 20 new words, even if you thought about them, it's way too much. So you still have to think about this in a realistic way. There are a few problems with this, though, which I will talk about on the next slide. Let's talk about this one first. So this is what I wanted to talk about from scaffolding to embedding. We start with scaffolding. If you just start out with a second language, scaffolding is very important. You need to mention there's a lot of new language. And related to my own experience, students aged 12, 13 would enter secondary school with yes, no, and a few bad words in English. And then I would have to start teaching them in maths from day one. And obviously, there's a lot of new words related to maths that they need to know. The easy ones, protected triangle and, these kind of fancy stuff, things, calculators whatsoever, but also procedural language like plus, times, minus. And that's only for maths. They have 6, 7, 8 other subjects in English as well. So that's a lot of language. And it's a good thing because in a way, it's a form of well, making them aware of the language because there's so much around them. But it's also very confusing if they don't get any scaffolding. So you really need to mention, well, these are the important words of this lesson. You can't assume students learn 6, 7, 8 new words every lesson of a day and then remember all of them. You start it with scaffolding and then you gradually replace this with the embedding, as this is more implicit and more difficult to recognize. So once they are older, they will still see some words they don't know, but they will be able to take realize what the meaning is from the context, or they will be able to find on their own what it is, or they will just ask you or whatever, but they will realize it's a keyword they need to know. Whereas when they just start out, it's all, important keywords. They have no idea where to start. And this is not just language related, it's also structure related. So if they have no idea what the story is about, they will also not be able to distinguish any structures there, the main points of the text, or the what is an example and what's actually a theory or a practical application. It's just one big mess to them. So making sure that you use scaffolding to scaffold both the language and the structures that are there. One more thing about scaffolding and embedding, and then we're going to talk about how to apply this to your lesson. Again, from my own experience, there's not that many good CLIL materials out there. there are a few really good CLIL authors, but they are limited. Teresa Ting is a CLIL author. She was speaking yesterday, and so she's a materials writer. Phil Ball, Keith Kelly was yesterday here. They're all material writers, but there's not that many of them. And in the Netherlands, the big publishers do translate the books because they realize there's a bilingual market, but they literally translate the Dutch book because they prefer not to change anything to the layout because of money. So there's no CLIL scaffolding whatsoever in there because it's basically just a translated book. And we're lucky with that. There's also subjects or even subjects or colleagues from abroad who don't even have any materials and have to develop everything on their own. So even if you have some kind of material, then the language might be embedded in there, but it's not explicit. So it's very important as a teacher that you realize, well, there's no scaffolding. There is, authentic language, but that doesn't mean that it's embedded. It basically means it's there, and you still have to think about which ones are the keywords. You can't assume that if you give them a text with all kinds of embedded keywords, second lesson of maths, that they are capable of filtering those out. So it's still up to the teacher to decide whether or not language requires scaffolding or not, and which language to embed or not. Okay, so that was for the first part of my plenary, talking about what scaffolding is. Just going to have a quick look at the chat to see if there's any questions or things I need to respond to, and otherwise I'm gonna go on to the next one. I see a lot of people saying good morning. I'm assuming people mentioned that right at the beginning. Any questions at this point? Otherwise I'll move on. Just gonna have a drink. And I'm talking fast again, aren't I? All right, no questions, then I'm gonna move on. I mentioned that I taught for 14 years and I worked at 2 schools, one 9 years, the other one 5 years. And when I switched schools, I had to start teaching in Dutch again. I had taught an English, mathematics English teacher for 9 years. And at the school that I started working at after that, I only had a few English language classes. I had to teach in Dutch again with a few other ones. And I was afraid I had to do all of my lesson preparations again and recreate all of my materials. Well, all I did was translate everything back to Dutch. But all the preparations that I did, including all of the scaffolding, worked really well. I found I could not only still use all of my CLIL activities and lesson preparations, but the Dutch students, surprise, surprise, actually did really well as I scaffolded the materials the same way as I used to. Less focus on the language, although it's still there, but the structures and the learning, that's definitely something that they also profited from. And also based on the fact that Vygotsky already talked about this prior to CLIL's existence, this triggered the idea for me that we can make a distinction in scaffolding. You can scaffold language and you can scaffold the learning process. Because scaffolding is also non-CLIL. The learning process is always there. You're always scaffolding learning. And with CLIL, there's the added component of also scaffolding language. It's not the same as helping. It's not the same as answering. I already talked about that. Maybe you know about the 4 C's. Communication being the language and cognition here being the learning process. So there's also a distinction in the definition that's sometimes used for CLIL from Non-CLIL, the 4 C's. Just wanted to mention that it's also related to this. So practical example, less theory. This is a book that I have in my house because I've got 2 young kids. And I was just wondering if you can see what this image has to do with scaffolding. Obviously, it's in Dutch. I'm not training my kids to be bilingual. Not a native speaker myself. But when I opened this book and started reading this with my kid, the first thing that I thought, oh, there's scaffolding here, which is of course a bit sad if you're reading a book with your 2-year-old and you're thinking about your work. But you know, it's me, I guess. You can see a couple of things here. First of all, there is learning scaffolded. By using the images linked to the specific important elements, they are taken out of context and shown as an individual object, removing any variables that might be confusing. And if you would ask a kid, well, what's a boat, which is what it says there, then if you show the entire picture, it might be a bit more challenging than if you just have the singled out thing over there. There's also language scaffolding. The words that can be used to describe things in this picture are given. So this can be applied to answering simple questions like, what does this mean? But also, which of these images are shown on the in the image, or which one of these four is the largest? You know, those kind of things. Easy questions that kids can answer using the phrases here. You can say that the four key elements in this picture are shown next to it, and this is obviously a book for a very young child. So how does this help? In this case, with scaffolding, it helps to start. It provides a few keywords that lowers the language barrier and makes it easier to start talking and gain momentum along the way. That's one of the ways that scaffolding can help, to make sure that there is not much more of a language barrier. It's easier to get going. Another way that it can help is to provide the correct words to use. Again, lowering the barrier. So it's not just helping to gain momentum, it's also knowing which words to use, so you don't get confused about which words might be related to this or not. So no synonyms or whatsoever. And go on. Yes. It also implies what the words mean. So there are images there, hints that are given as to what the words means, even if the child doesn't know them yet. So these might be ways to introduce new words, again, using scaffolding. See how much difference easy scaffolds like this make a task like this even easier. Now, let's talk about this from a different perspective. I just talked about the language and the learning perspective. This is something that Bernie Dutch in 2009, it's still in red, sorry about that, came up with when he created web quests. And he also noticed that if you create web quests, there are a lot of different ways you might want to use scaffolding, because there's just so much information out there, especially nowadays with the internet. So knowing that there's creating different kinds of scaffolds create some kind of structure to how you can approach scaffolding. And let's talk about all three of these stages separately. So we've got the input stage, basically where students receive information. It can be a resource by a teacher, but it can also just be a book. Transformation, it means that students receive information and do something with that, either structure it or create a more complex assignment with it or whatever. And output is basically where students produce something. So this can be either written or spoken output, obviously within a CLIL context. So there's a lot of language involved there, if you will, as well. It's all about producing information in a new way. So the first one, reception scaffolding, it helps students to perceive structure. So you provide a reception scaffold to help students do something with the input, to receive reception, hence the word receive the information. Again, perceive structure, but also perceive language. The second one, transformation scaffold, helps students to work with the data. I put in the picture of the working brain there, the brain at work, because this is really something that students, they can't just, they don't only receive information, they have to do something with it. I will give you an example on this in a minute. And the production scaffold is help students to provide structure. Notice the difference here, it's provide structure, where here, I repeat, where here, yes, my slides are not doing what I wanted to do. Yes, here it's perceive structure. So with an input, the input stage, it's perceiving structure that's already there and providing structure with the output stage to make sure that students have a structure they can use. Okay, if you combine these three ideas with the two ideas I mentioned before, language and learning combined with reception, transformation, and production, you get this scaffolding application table, if you will. This way of helping helps the student. I'm going to share some more lesson ideas with that. Let's just go on, otherwise I'm talking too long. So first one, an example of a combination of language and reception. It can be a partially filled in word list to be completed by students to support reading a text. Again, this is something that helps students be aware of the keywords involved. They can fill in this word list prior to reading the text, or try to figure out the meaning of the words while reading the text. And with this activity, students know what words are important and that need to focus on. And because they are mentioned explicitly, they will also remember them better. Get text to fill out while listening. I'm going to give you an example of this on the next slide, which is something that I actually did a lot in my lessons. It helps students to structure what they need to learn. So less focus on distracting words, more focused on the task. It's something that I often do when I gave an instruction and I just didn't want my students to sit back and enjoy the show. I really wanted them to actively listen and do something while they listen to my instruction. I'll give you an example of how this worked in my lesson on the next slide. Now, an example of learning. Notice, by the way, that there is less focus on language there. It's more about providing structure. Now, the learning combined with transformation can be a diagram to complete with pros and cons of a text. So it's not just reading the text, but students have to read the text, analyze it, and determine on their own which ones are pro and which ones are con. For example, compared to a statement, I don't know. You know, that's something that they can do here. Now, when you combine language with production, you get a series of phrases and words to be used in the presentation. So like sentence starters. And if you do this with learning, you can provide them with an outline of a presentation. So this is the basic structure of a presentation. You can fill in how the language and the content, but the structure is there. So that's not related to the language in any way. It's the structure that they use. Whereas with the series of phrases and words to be used, it's not structure related. It's really about the language there. So notice the distinction between the two. Now, you might have noticed there's one left out. I don't think this is possible. And if you have any ideas on how you can apply this there, I don't think it's, let me know. But I couldn't think of any example where you transform language, because obviously you can transform language in the past tense or whatever. But whenever you approach this from a scaffolding perspective, students are either producing output or receiving input. And there's no third option. The 4 language skills can be divided into those 2 categories. There's not a third category. So I couldn't figure out anything that fit in there. But if you have any suggestions, let me know. I'm always ready to learn more. So here's an example of what I use in my lesson. And this was copied, and you can see the date, copied from my lesson. And I simply said copy and complete while listening to the explanation. So they had to copy these steps. And then they had to fill in the blanks while they listened to me. And this is a way for me to provide scaffolding to the instruction. It also scaffolded my instruction because I knew I had to mention these steps and I shouldn't deviate from the main topic too much. So that it also helped me to, have a lot of structure there in my own explanations. Well, this is something that I just want to, let me just check the time. Oh, we still have some time left. This is something that was quite recently researched, and it's a book written on CLIL or on scaffolding, and the author focused on a lot of different ways to apply scaffolding. Now, because of the time, but also to prevent information overload, I will only focus on the first 4, just quickly mention how they are related to scaffolding, and CLIL also related to what I just talked about. But because this book is being referenced to a lot, I just want to share it with you, so you don't have to read it through yourself. The first one that she actually, I misspelled something there. Anyway, the first thing that the author mentioned is modeling as being a way to scaffold. And basically this means show, don't tell. Students need examples to imitate. They remember a lot more by just doing what you're doing than by having to do everything on their own. And there's been a lot of research on how much they actually hear when you talk to them, other than what they copy from you doing. And it also means that you need to provide them with clear instructions and language support. Again, the distinction between learning and language. And then provide an example of how it works, so that you show them how it works. And it works the same way as this presentation, right? I could just talk about all the theoretical stuff, but if I didn't give you any practical lesson ideas like I just did, it wouldn't, turn on any light bulbs. It wouldn't trigger anything. You really want to have some examples that relate to how you teach, because that way you can make it work. So that's one way to use scaffolding. Another one that I already used just now as well is bridging, which means that you activate prior knowledge. So you can use know want learned grids, KWL, or brainstorm activities, or there's lots of activities you can use to activate prior knowledge. But the brain works by using associations. So if you, and I'm sure that Therese knows a lot more about this, being a neuroscience, having some background in neuroscience, but if you do not do anything to activate prior knowledge, then new phrases and new key terms might not be related to the prior knowledge at all. So you really need to do this. And this can be a way of scaffolding again, because if this is a way to scaffold both the language and the learning, if you link this to prior knowledge related to a topic, a simple brainstorm activity can already help a lot here. This can also be done if you want them to do a true or false activity. For example, if you prepare for a debate, but you really want to brainstorm about all the different arguments available before that. Another way you can use this is to give them a few statements and think about whether or not they're wrong or right. Then you do your instruction or your explanation, or you ask them to read a text, and then afterwards you ask them again to relate to, see if they still agree with their original statements, just to make sure that they're constantly making connections and bridging basically the new knowledge to the old knowledge. Another thing that's happened and mentioned in the CLIL context quite a lot is BICS and CALP, or as it more recently is called, everyday language and academic language. The definition of academic language is basically that it's language you don't use when you have dinner and at the kitchen table you have a conversation. You use everyday language. You don't use academic language. Academic language is language used at schools basically, or at other professional levels, and per definition it's more abstract. There's less context there related to everyday language. So if you want to make sure that CALP is more effective, you need to contextualize. You need to make sure there is a lot of ways they can relate to this. So you scaffold learning CALP by using context. You impose multimedia input or text that are related to it, pictures, whatever, as long as you're supporting the learning process there, so that they can link it more easily to knowledge they already have, hence the bridging, but also put it more in context. And it's not just a word that they learned at, I don't know, geography, but they can see how it relates to other topics, to other subjects, to other things related to their life. Especially when they start studying and get older, there's going to be a lot more academic language and a lot more context. Last one, schema building is something that mentioned again by the author of this research. Example can be that when I had to write a piece on a piece of art when I was still at school, we would get a painting, and the teacher would say, well, here you have a painting, a picture of a painting, and just write a piece of text on this, about 500 words. Good luck. Well, you can imagine that I had no idea what to do, no idea where to start whatsoever. So then he provided me with some scaffolding. He said, okay, what you can do, and obviously this was the whole idea that we would, not be able to succeed at first and then get some ideas. He would divide the painting in 4. So one vertical, one horizontal line. And then he said, okay, first look at the top left corner, the top left part of the picture. What do you see in there? And what do you see when it comes to colors? What do you see, etc. Try to write, I don't know, about 100 words about what you see in there. The colors, the image, what shapes are in there. Do you see any persons? Is it dark or is it light? Answering a few questions. Now do the same thing for the next one and the next one and the next one. So you got 4 analyses really quickly, and then write a piece of text to combine that. So to see, okay, well, I see that in the top right corner. I see this in the lower left corner. How can I, how does that relate? Does it have to do anything with each other? Did the painter maybe do this on purpose or not? So with all of that structure, I was easily able to produce a 500-word commentary on this painting, because I got that structure. I got the sample questions, I got the way to divide the painting, and it really wasn't that hard anymore to write a short commentary. So if you do that, if you provide structure for, in this case, output or input, if you compare it to the analysis, this can be a lot easier if you use scaffolding. Sorry, I was looking at the other notes and I got confused in the middle of my sentence. For input, this can be a table or questions to fill out, like I just mentioned. There was also a lot of structure there. Yeah, I'm going to share with you some practical examples, and then we have some time for questions. So let me show you some examples of how you can scaffold language in your lesson. 3 different examples for scaffolding language. First one is a substitution table. So here I have 2 examples of substitution tables where students have to draw a conclusion, and you can see how language is there. But because it's already given, the focus is in this case on the learning. You know, they need to realize what's a correct sentence that we get. And you can ask them to write down the sentences so they practice the language as well, of course. But basically, they're just copying it. And the focus here is on the learning. They need to realize that some things melt in warm water or melt in boiling water or whatever. And obviously, they need to have some context here when it comes to language. Otherwise, they don't know what a pigment is or what a surface area to volume ratio is. You know, they need to have some context. They need to know some language in order to do this. But structuring it like this basically helps them to create a summary of sorts. Now, there's a lot of language here already given. You can make it a little harder by creating sentence starters. So there's less language here. So that immediately makes it more of a language support as well, because now they only have the structure and they have to come up with the rest of the language themselves. And these are sentence starters they can use in an essay related to history or in a piece of text. You can also make this even easier I would often ask students to present homework problems in front of the class, which they obviously found very scary. And I would just tell them, well, these are some sentences you can use. And they would start with, the problem I'm gonna discuss is, the correct answer is, the steps I followed were, so my conclusion is. You know, those words were there, and some students would literally say that and just use those steps and use that to continue talking during their presentation. Other students would only look at it for the first sentence and then just go from there and completely create their own presentation. But the thing you do not have anymore is students standing there not saying anything, because they can just read the first sentence, you know, and I would even give them some time to prepare this before they would stand over there. So there's no reason whatsoever that they shouldn't talk. So creating these sentence starters scaffolds their learning, scaffolds their language, and helps them to do a good job in front of the classroom. Another one, this is something that I mentioned before, the gap text. This is a more complicated one. It's a bit longer. You don't want your students to write down all of these words, but it's a way to create some kind of structure when you explain something. In this specific example, you can also use this as the information gap activity. So where students both have a different version of the text and they have to ask each other for the missing words. So here you see version A, for example, and there's also a version B. Now I put down a link, I put a link down there, and if you watch the recording, you will be able to copy this. But the link here, you can also just Google it, gap text generator, and then you will find this one. It's you just insert the text, you say which words you want to take out, and he creates 2 different versions of the same text. Brilliant. Less work for you, and I like those kind of things. You can even do this, where you say, well, I don't want them to be open, I want them to be multiple choice questions, making it easier for students again. So these are just a few ideas for your lesson that have to do everything with scaffolding. Now, when you scaffold language, it can be very helpful to think about what is important language to use. So class discussion, here you can see discussion stems, as is mentioned on this poster. I would even talk with my students about what is our important classroom English phrases, and then create a poster about that, so they have the language somewhere in the classroom and they can look at that whenever they have questions. these are just, I'm not saying that you have to use all of these, but just the idea of scaffolding classroom English is something that really helps the students a lot. Alrighty. Conclusion. I mentioned I was going to talk about 3 different things about why scaffolding is important. Well, it's important for every learner, but even more important to CLIL learners, because you all, despite having to scaffold their learning, you also have to scaffold their language proficiency and make sure that they go from there. I provided you with some structure and ideas you can use to think about the different ways to scaffold. It's not just scaffolding as a whole, but there is a few different things you can scaffold. You can scaffold the learning and the language. You can scaffold the input, the transformation, and the output. So it helps you to identify which elements of scaffolding you use a lot and which ones you might, need a bit more help with, or need some inspiration for, or maybe you didn't even realize you could also scaffold that as well. And I mentioned various ideas that you can use in your lesson: the partially filled in word list, the gap text, the diagram with pros and cons, the structured outline, tense and status, substitution table, and the information gap activity. So 6, 7-ish activities that you can use in your lesson. That's it. Any more questions? And I have on the next slide also all of the references that I used. So feel free to pause the video if you watch this in the recording, so you can find all of these on the internet if you want to, but I used all of this research to come to these conclusions. Any questions about this? We still have about 10 minutes to go, I believe, before we start with the break. I hope you like this. If you have any feedback or comments, please let me know. Just gonna. Thank you, Simone. Good to know it was inspiring. I also see some remarks about the expression hard CLIL. I'm one of those teachers. Yes, I didn't realize there was a definite. It's from the book. I got it over here. Putting CLIL into Practice by Phil Ball, Keith Kelly, who was here yesterday. They used it, and I believe it was also mentioned before, but that's the first time I encountered it. I didn't know the difference as well, but it made me realize that if you talk about CLIL, a lot of teachers talk about the different thing, and making this distinction between the content subject teachers and the language teachers already makes it a lot easier. I'm actually in the middle of, a sort of a discussion month within my Facebook group where we just constantly talk about the role of the English language teacher within the CLIL community of their school, because it's different. And there's also a lot of schools who don't have a hard CLIL setting. They only have soft CLIL, where an English teacher uses a lot of context. But yeah, it differs a lot per country. In the Netherlands, there's a lot of hard CLIL, but that's different in every country, of course. Will you present some more practical examples of ways to scaffold content in the next lesson? Oh, you mean the workshop? Yeah. Actually, that's more about how to prepare a CLIL lesson really fast. I will mention scaffolding. Yes, here we are. Yeah. I will mention scaffolding, but it's not focused on scaffolding alone. The workshop is called How to Prepare a CLIL Lesson in 15 Minutes, simply because I know that I can do that. I've done that for a year. I timed myself to see if I could do it in 15 minutes. And I shouldn't do this, answer and read the chat at the same time. So that's what the next workshop is going to be about. So I'll show some practical examples again on what you can use with CLIL in your lesson, and there will be scaffolding involved. So you will find a lot of practical examples. It's also a bit longer, so there's more time for me to maybe think of more examples related to scaffolding. So I can discuss that in more detail in a workshop as well. Oh, the answer has already been given. Yes, clilmedia.com. It's my company, and I write blog posts. There's a lot of things on there that you can do and learn more about CLIL that way.